The most dangerous question is the one asked without expecting a real answer. And that night, Jonathan Reed asked it with a half smile and a $300 glass of whiskey in his hand, not even looking up as he said, "Just one question. Where would you put $1 million?" The men around him chuckled softly, the kind of laughter that follows power, not humor, while the restaurant glowed in warm gold light, crystal glasses clinking, conversations flowing in low, confident tones, and in the middle of it all stood Emily Carter, quiet, still, holding a tray like she had nowhere else to be, and yet somehow exactly where she needed to be. And if you've ever seen someone underestimated in a room like that, you already know something was about to shift, and if not, stay with this moment, because it's the kind people remember long after the bill is paid. Emily didn't answer right away, didn't rush, didn't fill the silence the way most people did around Jonathan Reed. Instead, she noticed things, the way his watch caught the light, the way no one interrupted him, the way even silence seemed to orbit him like he owned that too. Jonathan finally looked up, just briefly, expecting hesitation, maybe a nervous laugh, but what he saw instead made him pause for half a second longer than usual. She wasn't intimidated, not impressed, just present. "Well," he added, tapping the table once, a subtle reminder of who he was, who everyone believed he was. Emily stepped forward, placed the glass of water down with precise calm, the kind that doesn't ask for permission, and said softly, "I wouldn't invest it." The laughter died instantly, like someone turned the volume off. One of the men shifted in his seat. Another glanced at Jonathan, waiting for his reaction. But it didn't come. "Not yet," Emily continued, her voice steady, almost too calm for the tension building in the air. "I'd first ask why you need to prove you can." And for the first time that evening, Jonathan Reed stopped moving, the glass in his hand hovering midair, his eyes lifting fully now, really seeing her, not as staff, not as background, but as something unexpected, something he hadn't planned for. And in that quiet second, something invisible changed between them, something no one at the table could name, but everyone could feel. No one spoke, not because they agreed, but because they did not know how to respond when the script they lived by suddenly stopped working. Jonathan Reed slowly set his glass down, the faint sound of crystal touching wood louder than it should have been, his eyes still fixed on Emily as if trying to place her in a world that made sense to him. Because nothing about this moment did, not the way she stood there without apology, not the way she had answered without hesitation, and certainly not the way she seemed completely unaffected by the weight of his name. "What makes you think I need to prove anything?" he asked finally, his voice quieter now, controlled, but carrying something new beneath it, not anger, not amusement, something closer to curiosity, the kind he rarely allowed himself. Emily did not answer immediately, and that pause, that deliberate silence, stretched just long enough to shift the balance again. Because in Jonathan's world, people rushed to fill silence. They competed for it. They paid for it. But she let it sit there, untouched. "Because you asked a stranger instead of trusting your own answer," she said simply, her tone even, not confrontational, just honest. One of the men at the table shifted again, this time more noticeably. Another reached for his phone, pretending to check something. Anything to avoid the tension building in the air, but Jonathan did not look away. He leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her now, really studying her. The way a man like him studied markets, patterns, risks, and what makes you think I do not already have an answer, he pressed. Emily's gaze flickered briefly to the window, where the city lights reflected like scattered stars against the glass, then back to him. "You do," she said. "But you are not sure it is enough." And that was the moment something shifted inside him, subtle, almost imperceptible, but real, because it was not the words themselves, it was how easily she said them, like she was not guessing, not impressing, just observing. And for a man who had built his entire life on control, on certainty, on always being the one who knew more than everyone else in the room, that kind of clarity from someone he had already dismissed felt unfamiliar. "You talk like you have been in my world," he said, a faint edge returning, not defensive, but probing. Emily gave the smallest hint of a smile, not warm, not cold, just knowing. "No," she replied. "I talk like I have watched people in your world long enough to see what they miss." The words landed differently this time, not sharp, but steady, like a quiet truth that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. And around them, the restaurant slowly resumed its rhythm. Conversations picking back up, glasses clinking again, but at that table, something had changed permanently, because Jonathan Reed, the man who was used to being listened to, was now the one paying attention, and Emily Carter, the waitress no one had noticed 5 minutes ago, had just become the only person in the room he could not ignore. Jonathan Reed had spent his entire life being the one who saw through people, the one who could walk into a room and, within seconds, understand who mattered, who did not, who could be useful, and who would eventually fade into the background. It was how he built his empire, how he turned a modest inheritance into something that shaped markets and moved numbers most people could not even comprehend. And yet standing there in front of him was a woman he could not read, not completely, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "You watch people," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of her words. Emily nodded once, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, steady, controlled. "It is part of the job," she said, but there was something in the way she said it that suggested it was not just the job, not just taking orders and delivering plates. Jonathan leaned forward slightly now, his interest no longer hidden. "Most people in your position are too busy, trying not to make mistakes to notice anything beyond their next step," he said, not unkindly, but with the quiet certainty of someone used to being right. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "Most people are," she agreed, "but I learned a long time ago that if you only focus on what is in front of you, you miss what actually matters." And for a brief moment, something flickered across Jonathan's face, recognition, perhaps, or memory, something buried beneath years of strategy and control. "And what exactly is that?" he asked, softer now, the edge almost gone. Emily glanced around the room. The soft hum of conversations, the polished surfaces, the carefully curated elegance that made everything feel important. Then back at him. "Patterns," she said. "The way people repeat themselves without realizing it. The way they think they are making new decisions when they are really just proving old ones." Jonathan exhaled quietly, leaning back again. But this time it was different, less guarded, more thoughtful. Because what she was describing was not foreign to him. It was the foundation of everything he did, and yet hearing it from her, framed the way she framed it, made it feel less like a strategy and more like a truth he had stopped questioning. "You sound like someone who studied this," he said, watching her closely. Emily's expression did not change, but her eyes shifted for just a fraction of a second, enough to reveal something deeper beneath the surface, something she chose not to say out loud. "I studied enough," she replied, carefully, and that was all she offered. No explanation, no details, just enough to confirm and nothing more. Jonathan noticed, of course he did. He noticed everything that did not quite align, everything that hinted at a story beneath the surface. And for the first time that evening, the question forming in his mind was not about money, not about strategy, but about her, who she was, how she ended up here, and why someone who spoke like that was standing in a uniform serving tables instead of sitting at one. "You are not where you belong," he said before he could stop himself, the words slipping out, honest and unfiltered. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave the slightest shake of her head, almost imperceptible. "Everyone is somewhere for a reason," she said quietly, and there was no bitterness in her voice, no regret, just a calm acceptance that felt stronger than either of those things. Jonathan did not respond immediately, because for the first time in a very long time, he was not sure what to say next, and that silence, the kind he once controlled so effortlessly, now belonged to her. Jonathan did not like uncertainty. He built his life eliminating it, reducing risk to numbers, outcomes to probabilities, people to patterns he could predict and control, and yet standing across from Emily, he could feel something slipping outside that system, something he could not quantify, and that bothered him more than he expected. "So you believe everything is exactly where it should be," he said, his tone measured, but there was a subtle challenge beneath it now, the kind that did not ask for agreement, but tested conviction. Emily did not look away, did not soften. "No," she replied. "I believe people end up where their decisions take them, whether they understand those decisions or not." One of the men at the table let out a quiet breath, shifting in his chair as if the conversation had gone somewhere it was never supposed to go. Because this was not how these dinners worked. This was not the rhythm they were used to. Jonathan noticed it. Of course he did. The discomfort, the tension, the way control of the room had shifted without anyone formally acknowledging it. And instead of shutting it down like he normally would, he leaned into it. "And you think I do not understand mine," he said, a faint edge returning, not anger, but something sharper, something more personal. Emily tilted her head slightly, considering him, not as a customer, not as a billionaire, but as a person she was trying to understand. "I think you understand them very well," she said. "I just think you stopped questioning them a long time ago." The words landed quietly, but they carried weight, the kind that did not need volume to be felt. Jonathan's jaw tightened just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough to reveal that something had hit closer than he was comfortable admitting. "Questioning decisions is how people lose money," he replied, his voice firmer now, more familiar, more like the man everyone expected him to be. Emily nodded once, acknowledging the logic, but not conceding to it. "And not questioning them is how people lose perspective," she said, just as calmly. And there it was, not an argument, not a confrontation, but a line drawn between two ways of seeing the world, one built on control, the other on awareness. And for a moment, neither moved, neither spoke, the silence between them no longer empty, but full of something unspoken, something unresolved. Jonathan broke it first, but this time his voice was different, less certain, more curious than commanding. "You speak like someone who walked away from something," he said, watching her closely. And this time, Emily did not answer right away, not because she did not have an answer, but because she was deciding whether he deserved it. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray, the only visible sign of hesitation. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "walking away is the only way to see something clearly." Jonathan held her gaze, searching for more, for context, for explanation, but she offered none, just that single sentence, complete and closed. And for the first time that evening, he felt something unfamiliar, not confusion, not frustration, but interest without control, and that was something he had not experienced in a very long time. Jonathan Reed was not a man who got curious without acting on it. Curiosity to him was not a feeling. It was a signal, something to investigate, something to resolve. And as Emily stood there in front of him, calm and unreadable, that signal grew louder. "What did you walk away from?" he asked, more direct now. The question no longer casual, no longer part of a passing conversation, but something deliberate, something he intended to get an answer to. Emily met his gaze, and for a moment, the room seemed to narrow around them, the background fading into a blur of soft voices and dim light. "Something that looked right from the outside," she said, "but was built on the wrong reasons." Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in skepticism, but in focus. "That sounds expensive," he said, and this time, there was no humor in it. Emily gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "It was," she replied, "just not in dollars." And that was when it happened, subtle, quiet, but unmistakable. One of the men at the table leaned forward suddenly, his expression shifting from passive observer to recognition. "Wait," he said, looking between them, then directly at Emily. "I know you." The words cut through the air, not loudly, but with enough weight to change everything. Jonathan's attention shifted instantly, his instincts snapping into place, because recognition like that did not happen by accident. "From where?" Jonathan asked, his voice low, controlled, but now carrying something sharper. The man hesitated for a second, as if piecing it together, then said, "Columbia Business Forum. About 3 years ago, there was a speaker, young, sharp, talked about behavioral finance and decision bias. You broke down investor psychology in a way I have never heard before." He looked at Emily again, more certain now. "That was you, wasn't it?" Silence followed, heavier this time, because this was no longer a conversation about opinions, it was about identity, about something hidden now stepping into the light. Emily did not react immediately, but the stillness in her posture shifted just slightly, like a door opening a fraction, enough to confirm without saying it outright. Jonathan turned back to her slowly, the pieces aligning in his mind with unsettling clarity. The way she spoke, the way she observed, the way she understood patterns, it was not accidental, It was trained, refined, deliberate. You gave that talk, he said, not as a question, but as a realization. Emily exhaled softly, almost inaudible, then nodded once. A long time ago, she said. But the weight behind those words suggested it was not time that mattered. It was what had happened since. Jonathan leaned forward again, this time without any pretense, without the barrier he had maintained all evening. People do not go from that stage to this floor by accident, he said, his voice steady. But the meaning clear. Something had changed, something significant. And for the first time since the conversation began, Emily looked away first, not in defeat, not in discomfort, but in choice. Like she was deciding how much of the truth to let exist in this room. No, she said quietly, they do not. And that single sentence carried more weight than anything else she had said so far, because now the question was no longer whether she was extraordinary. It was why she was here at all. And Jonathan Reed, a man who built his life uncovering what others tried to hide, realized that this was no longer about a simple question. This was about a story he had not been invited to hear, and yet could not walk away from. The room did not return to normal after that. Not really, because once a truth like that surfaces, even quietly, it changes how everyone sees everything that follows. Jonathan Reed leaned back slowly, but his eyes never left Emily, and now there was no trace of dismissal left in them. Only focus, sharp and calculating, the kind that had built companies and broken competitors. So you understand markets, behavior, decision, theory, he said, his voice steady. And yet you are here. It was not an insult. Not anymore. It was a contradiction he could not ignore. Emily adjusted her grip on the tray, subtle, controlled, but this time the movement carried weight, like something pressing beneath the surface. Understanding something does not mean you choose to stay in it, she replied, and that answer should have ended it, should have been enough. But Jonathan was not a man who stopped at surface-level explanations. No, he said quietly, leaning forward again. But walking away from something like that usually costs more than people can afford. The table had gone completely silent now. No one pretending to check their phone anymore. No one laughing, just listening. Because something real was unfolding in front of them. Something that did not belong in a place like this. Emily's eyes held his for a second longer than before. And this time there was something different there. Not just calm, but resistance. Like a line she had drawn long ago and had no intention of crossing. It did, she said simply, and the way she said it left no room for follow-up. But Jonathan did not stop. He could not. Not now. Not when the pattern was incomplete. Then why stay away? He asked, softer now. Less like a challenge, more like a question he did not expect to ask tonight. Emily's gaze dropped briefly to the table, the reflection of the overhead light flickering across the polished surface, and for the first time, the silence she held did not feel like control. It felt like memory, like something she had learned to carry without letting it show. Because going back would mean becoming someone I decided not to be, she said, her voice quiet, but firm. And that answer landed deeper than anything else she had said, because it was no longer about intelligence, or money, or strategy. It was about choice, identity, something harder to measure, harder to challenge. Jonathan exhaled slowly, leaning back again. But this time there was no calculation in the movement, only thought, real thought, the kind that does not come easily to someone used to having answers. And for a moment, he said nothing, just watched her, as if trying to understand a decision that did not follow the rules he had always trusted. One of the men at the table finally spoke, his voice lower now, almost cautious. So you just left it all behind? He asked, and Emily turned slightly toward him, her expression unchanged. No, she said. I carried it with me. And if you have ever had to walk away from something that defined you, you already know that is not something you forget. It is something you reshape, something you learn to live with. And maybe that is why moments like this matter, why people lean in, why they listen, because sometimes the real story is not about success, but about what someone chooses to leave behind. Jonathan noticed the shift in the room, the way people were no longer just observing, but connecting. And for the first time that evening, he did not try to control it, did not redirect it. Instead, he asked the one question that had been building since the moment her answer first stopped him. What happened? And this time, there was no trace of power in his voice, only genuine curiosity. And that was the most unexpected shift of all. Emily did not answer right away, and this time the silence felt different, not controlled, not strategic, but heavier, like something just beneath the surface was deciding whether it was ready to be seen. Jonathan waited, not impatiently, not pushing, just watching, because he understood now that whatever she was holding back was not something you could force. It had to be chosen. "You ever notice," she said finally, her voice softer than before, "how people only ask what happened when they think the answer will make sense to them?" Jonathan did not respond, but something in his expression shifted, because he recognized that pattern. He had lived it, built decisions around it, dismissed things that did not fit clean explanations. Emily continued, her eyes drifting briefly to the far side of the room, where a couple sat laughing quietly, untouched by the tension at this table. "The truth is, most things do not make sense when you first see them," she said. "They only look obvious after you know how they ended." One of the men leaned forward slightly, drawn in despite himself, because this was no longer just a conversation. It was something unfolding, piece by piece. Emily's fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the tray again, a small movement, but this time it revealed something more, a habit, maybe, or a way of grounding herself. "3 years ago," she said, and the words alone were enough to shift the air again, because now there was a timeline, a beginning, something real. "I was standing in a room not that different from this one," she continued. "People in expensive suits, conversations about numbers that sounded important, decisions that would affect people no one in the room would ever meet." Jonathan's gaze sharpened, because now the pieces were not just aligning. They were pointing somewhere specific, somewhere uncomfortably familiar. "I was invited to speak," she said, "about decision-making, about how people think they are rational when they are really just repeating what feels safe." The man who had recognized her nodded slightly, as if confirming it, remembering it. "You challenged the room," he added quietly. Emily glanced at him, just briefly, then back to Jonathan. "I did more than that," she said, and for the first time, there was something else in her voice, not regret, not pride, something closer to consequence. "I told them that most of their biggest decisions were not driven by logic," she continued, "but by fear disguised as confidence." The table went still again, because that was not a comfortable thing to hear. Not then, not now. Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly, not in defense, but in recognition, because he had seen that too, even in himself, even if he never said it out loud. "That does not sound like something that would end badly," he said, but there was a subtle shift in his tone, like he already knew it had. Emily gave a small, almost invisible exhale. "It does when the people in the room are the ones who benefit from others not seeing it," she said, and that was the first real crack, the first clear sign that this was not just a story about walking away. It was about something that pushed her out, something that made staying no longer an option. One of the men glanced at Jonathan, then back at Emily, as if realizing that this was no longer just her story. It was connected to something bigger, something closer to them than they were comfortable admitting. Emily's gaze lowered for a second, then lifted again, steady, composed. But now there was something unmistakable behind it, something that had been waiting to surface. "You asked what happened," she said quietly. "But the better question is, who decided it should?" No one moved after that, not because they were unsure, but because something in the air had shifted into a space where truth was about to cost something, and everyone could feel it. Jonathan Reed did not look away, not this time, because the question she had just placed in front of him did not feel abstract. It felt directed. "Who decided?" he repeated quietly, and there was no challenge in his voice now, only a growing awareness that the answer might not sit comfortably with him. Emily held his gaze, steady, unflinching, and for the first time, there was no hesitation left in her expression, only clarity. "The people who funded the decisions," she said. "The ones who sat at the top and preferred outcomes over truth." A subtle ripple moved through the table, not visible, but present, because every man sitting there understood exactly what that meant. Jonathan's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table, not in anger, but in recognition. "That still does not explain why you left," he said, though now his voice carried something different, something closer to concern than control. Emily nodded once, as if she had expected that. It does when you realize the system is not designed to correct itself, she said. It is designed to protect itself. The words landed heavier than anything before, because they were no longer philosophical. They were specific, pointed, and for the first time, the man who had recognized her shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by something quieter, more cautious. You presented a case, he said slowly, almost carefully, about a series of investments that looked profitable on paper but were structured to fail long-term. Emily did not look at him, but the slight pause in her breathing confirmed it. Yes, she said. Jonathan's mind moved quickly now, faster than anyone else at the table could follow, connecting pieces, timelines, decisions. Those were not just theoretical examples, he said, more to himself than to her. Emily finally looked back at him, and this time, there was no distance left between what she knew and what she was willing to say. No, she replied. They were real. The room felt smaller now, tighter, like the walls had moved in just enough to make everyone aware of it. Jonathan's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. And you exposed them. Emily's answer came without pause. I tried. And that was the moment everything changed, because it was no longer a story about someone walking away from success. It was about someone being pushed out for refusing to ignore something bigger, something inconvenient. Jonathan leaned back slowly, his gaze never leaving her. But now there was something else there, something deeper, something that had not been present before, not curiosity, not even respect, but realization. Because he knew the world she was describing, he operated in it, shaped it, benefited from it. And for the first time, he was forced to see it from the other side. What happened to the report? He asked, and even he seemed to realize how quiet his voice had become. Emily's lips pressed together for a brief second. Then she said, it disappeared. Simple, direct, final. One of the men at the table shifted again, this time more noticeably, his hand tightening around his glass. That is not possible, he said quickly, but the certainty in his voice did not hold. Emily did not argue, did not push. She simply said, it is when the people who decide what matters are the same ones being questioned. And that silence returned, heavier now, not empty, but filled with something undeniable. Because if you are listening to this and you are wondering whether you would have spoken up or stayed quiet, you are already asking the question that changes everything. And Jonathan Reed, for the first time in a very long time, was no longer sure which side of that answer he stood on. The silence that followed was no longer uncomfortable. It was honest, and that made it heavier than anything else that had been said that night. Jonathan Reed sat still, not because he did not have something to say, but because for the first time in years, he was not sure his words would matter more than what he had just heard. The noise of the restaurant slowly returned around them. Glasses clinking, distant laughter. The soft rhythm of a world that kept moving whether people changed or not. But at that table, something had already shifted beyond repair. Jonathan finally exhaled, long and quiet, his gaze dropping briefly to the reflection of the lights in his glass before lifting back to her. And you chose to walk away from all of it, he said, not as a question, but as a realization that still did not fully make sense to him. Emily nodded once, calm, steady, unchanged. I chose not to become part of it, she corrected gently, and that distinction lingered in the air longer than either of them expected, because it was not about leaving success, it was about refusing a version of it. Jonathan studied her, really studied her, not as a puzzle to solve, not as an opportunity, but as a person who had made a choice he was not sure he could have made himself. Most people would have stayed, he said quietly, and there was no judgment in his voice, only truth. Emily gave a faint smile, the first one that felt almost warm, almost human in a way that had nothing to do with performance or control. Most people do, she said, and there was no bitterness there, just understanding. Jonathan leaned back slowly, his posture no longer sharp, no longer guarded, just thoughtful, the kind of stillness that comes when something inside you is rearranging itself without permission. One of the men at the table cleared his throat softly, as if unsure whether the moment was over or just paused. But Jonathan did not look at him, did not acknowledge anything else in the room. His attention remained on Emily. What would you have done? He asked suddenly, his voice low, almost uncertain, if you had stayed. Emily tilted her head slightly, considering the question, not because she did not know the answer, but because she understood what he was really asking. I would have learned how to ignore things that matter, she said. And eventually, I would have gotten very good at it. Jonathan let out a quiet breath, something between a laugh and something else, something heavier, because he recognized that answer in a way he could not deny, the truth of it settling in a place he usually kept protected. Emily picked up her tray then, the movement small, simple, but final, like the end of something that did not need to be extended. Your dinner will be ready shortly, she said, her tone returning to something more neutral, more distant, but not cold, just complete. Jonathan nodded once, not out of habit, but out of something closer to respect, real respect, the kind that does not need to be spoken. As she turned and walked away, blending back into the rhythm of the restaurant, he did not call her back, did not ask for more, because for the first time, he understood that not everything valuable could be negotiated, bought, or explained. Some things simply had to be accepted, and as he sat there, the question he had asked at the beginning of the night felt smaller now, almost irrelevant, because the answer he received was not about money, it was about something far more difficult to measure. And as the noise of the room carried on around him, Jonathan Reed realized that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is not prove what they know, but decide what they refuse to become, and that was something no amount of wealth could ever purchase.